Picture the most controlled man you have ever met. The one who never raises his voice because he never has to. The one who walks into a room and the room changes without him saying a word. The one who has built something most people could not imagine from nothing, through patience and intelligence and a discipline so complete it looks from the outside like the absence of feeling. Now picture that man sitting across from a woman who sees straight through all of it, not because she is trying to, but because reading what people hide beneath what they show is literally her profession. She is a neurosurgeon. He is the most quietly powerful figure in Boston's underworld. They should never have been in the same room. They ended up building something together that neither of them planned, and both of them needed more than they knew how to admit. And then, at the moment it mattered most, he did what powerful men do when they get afraid. He destroyed it first. He looked at her and said, "Without blinking, I never loved you." The problem was she already knew it was a lie, and she was already carrying proof that he was wrong about everything he thought he was protecting himself from. Some people are born to lead, and the lessons that separate the ones who truly understand power from everyone else are not taught in any school, not written in any textbook. They are learned only by the people who have paid the real price for every decision they have made. This channel is not here to romanticize crime. It is here to examine mindset, to look honestly at what it takes to build something real, and to uncover the truths about strength and loyalty and human nature that most people never get close enough to see. What this story teaches is something that every person who has ever chosen control over connection will eventually have to face. The most sophisticated intelligence in the world cannot protect you from yourself. Dominic Reyes could outmaneuver federal investigators, rival networks, and decades of accumulated enemies. The one thing he could not outmaneuver was a woman who refused to be less than honest and a child who arrived as evidence that all his careful distance had already failed. Real power, the story argues, is not the ability to feel nothing. Real power is the courage to feel everything and choose rightly anyway. If that is the kind of story you are here for, you are in the right place. Hit the like button if this opening already has you thinking, drop a comment with where you are watching from, and subscribe, because every story on this channel is built around exactly that kind of truth, and there are many more coming.
Brain does not lie. That is the first thing they teach you in neurosurgery. Every other organ in the human body can compensate, can mask, can perform a kind of biological theater that fools even experienced eyes. The heart can maintain rhythm long after the system around it is failing. The lungs can move air through damaged tissue with surprising efficiency. But the brain shows you exactly what is happening, exactly when it is happening, with a precision that leaves no room for comfortable interpretation. Camilla Voss had spent 11 years learning to read that precision. She was 31 years old, and she was very good at her job. It was 7 minutes past 7 on a Tuesday evening when the emergency call came through. She was in the middle of reviewing imaging files from that morning, a cold cup of coffee on her desk, and her coat still on, because she had been meaning to leave for the past 40 minutes and kept finding one more thing to look at. Pager went off. She read the number she was already moving before she finished reading it. The patient had been brought in without identification. Just a contact number written on a piece of paper that had been folded and unfolded. So many times the creases had gone soft. The intake notes said male, mid-40s, found unresponsive. Possible subdural hemorrhage. The imaging confirmed it within 8 minutes of arrival. Camila reviewed the scan in the hallway outside radiology. Standing under the fluorescent lights with her reading glass on and everything else in the hospital going quiet around her, the way it always did when she focused completely on something. The bleed was significant. Hemisphere, building pressure. Without intervention in the next 2 hours, the outcome would be irreversible. She was scrubbing in when the floor coordinator caught her arm. "Dr. Voss." The coordinator's voice had a specific quality, careful, slightly lowered. The patient. We have a name now. Camilla kept scrubbing. Who is it? A pause. Then the name. She did not stop moving. Hands kept working the brush in precise automatic circles. Her face behind the surgical mask stayed exactly as it was. Thank you, she said, and she walked into the operating room. 7 hours and 32 minutes later, she was standing outside the intensive care unit on the fourth floor, looking through the glass at the man she had just kept alive. He was, even unconscious, one of the most physically still people she had ever seen. Not the stillness of unconsciousness that was a different quality, slack and absent. This was the kind of stillness that suggested the body had been trained, over a very long time, to occupy space, without announcing itself. He was broad through the shoulders, somewhere between lean and solid, with dark hair that had gone silver at the temples. His hands were folded over his chest with a precision that seemed too deliberate for a man who had no awareness of the gesture. Men stood around the perimeter of his room. None of them were nurses. The attending on overnight came up beside her. Everything all right? Fine, Camilla said. What she did not say was, I knew who he was when I started. I knew you the shame before they told me, and I operated anyway, because that is what you do. That is what all of it is for, the years of training. The 3 a.m. calls, and the cold coffee it is for this. For keeping someone alive who would otherwise not be, regardless of who that someone is. What she did not say was, his name is Dominic Ryeyes, and in certain rooms in this city, people say that name carefully. She stood at the glass for another minute. Then she went to write her post-operative notes. Notification arrived the following morning. Not a phone call, not an email, a physical envelope, placed on her desk in her office, on the third floor at some point between 7 and 8 in the morning, when the corridor was busy enough that no one would notice a person walking purposefully through it. Her name was on the front, just her name, written by hand. Inside was a single document. It was a medical file. The name at the top was James Voss, her father. Adoptive father. To be precise, though, she had never used that word out loud in his presence, not once in 23 years. Because he never used it, and she followed his lead in the way that children follow the lead of the adults they are trying to belong to. She sat down. The file was detailed. It was also, she understood within about 90 seconds, not something that had been assembled through normal channels. The imaging, the blood work, the specialist consultations for stations from a practice in Cambridge that she had not known her father was attending, none of this had come from a hospital records department. Someone had gathered it from multiple sources and put it together in one place. Stage 3, pancreatic. Being managed, apparently, with a level of care that had kept him functional, for she looked at the dates, 14 months. 14 months her father had been living with this. 14 months he had not told her. At the bottom of the last page, a single handwritten line. It read, there is an experimental treatment protocol not yet approved by the FDA. Access to it exists through one channel, DDR. Camila set the file on her desk. She put both palms flat on the surface of the desk and looked at the wall in front of her. Then she picked up her phone and blocked the number she did not have, that had not contacted her, that she did not in any way want to call, and she went to cover her morning clinic. She lasted 3 days, 3 days of rounds and surgeries, and a department meeting that ran 40 minutes over time. Days of calling her father in the evenings and listening to him sound perfectly fine, exactly as he always sounded, with his precise diction and his habit of asking about her work before she could ask about his health. 3 days of knowing what she knew and not knowing what to do with it. On the fourth day, she called the number on the phone. It rang twice. Then, a man's voice, not Dominic Ryeyes, someone else, said simply, Dr. Voss. He'll see you this afternoon. 4 o'clock. I'll send the address. She did not ask how they knew it was her. The address was a building in the South End that looked, from the outside, like a modest commercial property. Architecture firm, said the lettering on the door. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment and thought about what she was doing. She thought about it clearly, the way she thought about surgical decisions, listing the variables, acknowledging the risks, and then making a choice. She went inside. The interior was not what she expected. It was quiet, clean in the particular way that suggests cleaning happens regularly and thoroughly rather than for performance. There was a reception area that no one was sitting in, a hallway that led somewhere with purpose, and a man she had never seen before who appeared from a side door and said this way, "Please." She followed him to the end of the hallway and through a door that opened into a large, well-lit room set up as an office. Books on 3 walls, a desk positioned to face the door. Behind the desk, Dominic Reyes. He was dressed plainly dark trousers, a gray shirt with the sleeves pushed up. He was looking at something in a folder when she entered. He closed it before she could see what it contained. Then he looked at her. His eyes were the darkest brown she had ever seen on a living person, and they did not contain any of the warmth that most people deploy automatically when meeting someone new. They contained something else. Assessment, recognition, the specific quality of attention that belongs to people who've spent years in situations where reading a room correctly was not a professional skill but a survival one. "Mr. Voss," he said. "Mr. Rise," she said. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. She sat. "You knew who I was before you started that surgery," he said. Not a question. She had prepared for several opening moves. This was the most direct one, and somehow still the one that caught her slightly off guard. "You know who my father is," she said. "Given that the file you sent me took some effort to compile." Something moved very briefly across his face. Not quite a smile. Something adjacent. "I do," he said. She folded her hands in her lap. "Then I think you should tell me what you want." What Dominic Reyes wanted, it turned out, was not what she had prepared herself to hear. He explained it without preamble. He was building a medical clinic, a real one, licensed and staffed and designed to serve the population of South Boston that fell through every gap in the healthcare system. Working families without insurance, elderly residents on fixed incomes, people whose alternative to a free clinic was an emergency room visit that would financially devastate them. He needed a medical advisor, not a figurehead, not a name on a letterhead for credibility. Someone with genuine expertise who would help design real protocols and catch the places where good intentions intersected badly with medical reality. "Why not hire someone?" Camila asked. "Someone who doesn't know who you are." "Because they'd perform," he said. "They'd tell me what they thought I wanted to hear. You know who I am, and you sat down anyway. That means you're here to have an actual conversation. That's what I need." She looked at him for a moment, and in exchange, "You connect my father with this treatment protocol. Yes, before I begin, not contingent on performance." He tilted his head slightly. "Before you begin." She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "I have conditions." "Tell me," as she told him. Stated plainly her schedule, not his complete legal transparency. One gray area, and she walked without notice. The information about her father's treatment options, delivered in full, before her first day of work. He listened to all three without interrupting. She finished, he said agreed. Just that. No counteroffer. No visible irritation at being told what she required. The word came out the same way he had said her name, quiet and complete. Like he had already considered the options, and this was simply the accurate one. She had not expected that. She had expected negotiation, some reflex toward control. Instead, she got a man who seemed entirely unbothered by the idea of someone else setting terms. She would think about that later. What it meant about him. "One more thing," she said. Waited. "I need to understand what the file on my father cost you, not financially." Leverage ways, a pause. Then something shifted in the room, not physically, not in any way she could easily describe, just a quality of recalibration. "It cost me nothing," he said. "I pulled it because I needed to understand who you were before I contacted you, not to use it to know whether you were someone who could be trusted with what I'm trying to build." She looked at him for a long moment. He was very good at reading people. She had been doing it since long before medical school, since childhood. In fact, since growing up in a house where the adults were perfectly kind and completely emotionally opaque, and she learned to read the gaps between what people said and what they meant as a form of self-preservation. Dominic Reyes was not performing ease. He was not managing his presentation. He was sitting in a chair on the other side of his desk, telling her the truth. And it showed in the way that truth always showed to someone who knew how to look. She extended her hand across the desk. Then we have an agreement. He stood and shook it. His hand was large and the grip was measured firm but not demonstrative, nothing to prove. She noted the calluses. Not a man whose power lived entirely in conference rooms. I'll have the information about your father's treatment sent to your office by end of business tomorrow, he said. She stood. I'll be in touch about a start date. She was almost at the door. He said, Dr. Vafas. She turned the surgery, he said. 7.5 hours. Most surgeons I've spoken to said it should have been stopped at the 4-hour mark. She held his gaze. Most surgeons would have been right. It was a complicated call. What made you continue? She thought about that for a moment. The imaging at hour 4 showed a specific pattern that I've seen twice in my career. Times I pushed through. Both patients recovered full function. She paused. If I'd been wrong, it would have ended badly. I wasn't wrong. He nodded, slowly, one single nod. She left. She sat in her car for a few minutes before starting the engine. She was a person who dealt in evidence, and she was attempting to assess, with intellectual honesty, what she had just observed. A man with a dangerous reputation who had been straightforward with her at every point in the conversation. No hidden language, no misdirection, no attempt to charm or intimidate. Stated what he wanted, agreed to her conditions without debate, and told her the truth when she asked a pointed question about leverage. That did not make him safe. Safe was not the category he occupied. But honest, that category was more complicated than she had assumed walking in. She started the engine and drove back toward the hospital. The file arrived the next morning, as promised. 26 pages of documentation on a Phase 2 clinical trial being conducted by a research group in Zurich, combined with access to a compassionate use program that had not yet been announced publicly. It was exactly what she needed. It was also, she noted, accompanied by the name and direct contact information for the lead researcher, and a note indicating that the initial consultation had already been arranged for the following week. He had not waited for her to ask. Simply done it. She called her father that evening. She told him she had found something and that she was coming to see him on Saturday. He said, wonderful. Her mother would be pleased. Would she stay for dinner? She said yes. She did not tell him how she had found it. She started work on a Monday. The clinic space was on the ground floor of a building on West Broadway, a solid, plain structure that had been retrofitted with more care than its exterior suggested. Clean lighting, functional layout, examination rooms to handle real patient volume. The kind of setup that had been designed by someone who understood that dignity and medical care were not separable. She walked through it with a clipboard and made notes for 45 minutes before anyone spoke to her. Then, "You're very thorough." She turned. The speaker was a young man in his late 20s, leaning against the doorframe of what would eventually be the waiting room. He was dark-haired with an open, mobile face and the kind of ease in a room that some people are simply born with. "Raphael Rise," he said, crossing to offer his hand. Rafe, I'm told, I'm running logistics for this project, which apparently means I handle everything Dominic doesn't want to think about. That's a broad job description, she said. You have no idea. He said it with real warmth, no edge. Talks about you, you know. Well, he doesn't talk about people. But he mentioned you twice in 4 days, which in Dominic Rye's terms is basically a dedicated monologue. What did he say? Rafe thought about it. He said you were precise. That's it? From him, that's a significant compliment. He once described the federal government as approximate. She did not mean to laugh. She did, slightly. Rafe looked very pleased with himself. Dominic arrived at the clinic at 10 that morning and went through the space with a completely different quality of attention than his brother, less visual, more structural. Asking questions about load-bearing walls and electrical capacity, and whether the WAC had been inspected, he greeted Camila with a brief nod and then said, "Walk me through what you found." She walked him through it. Listened the way she had noticed he listened in their first meeting completely. No checking his phone, no anticipating her sentences, no redirecting, just present, absorbing. When she finished, He said, the pharmacy storage is the problem. Yes, she said, the current setup will pass inspection, but it won't pass practical use at the patient volume we're projecting. You need to double the secure cabinet capacity and add climate monitoring in the corner unit. I'll have it done by Thursday. Good, she made a note. The examination room layout also needs adjustment. Room 3 is a dead end for a patient who needs to leave quickly. Emergency egress should never be an afterthought. He looked at her. You're thinking about patients who might need to leave without being seen. I am thinking about patients who are afraid, she said. Patients in underserved communities often have complicated relationships with authority. If a room feels like a trap, they won't come back. And a patient who doesn't come back is a patient who doesn't get treated. A moment passed. Then he said, fix it however you think is right. Later that afternoon, she was reviewing staffing templates at a folding table in the back of the clinic's space when she looked up and saw Dominic across the room. In a meeting with 3 suppliers, she watched without intending to. He was not speaking much. He asked 2 questions and then listened to the answers with that same full attention. After the second answer, there was a pause, and then one of the suppliers said something quietly and revised a number that Camila suspected had been inflated in the original proposal. He hadn't threatened anyone. He hadn't raised his voice. Just asked precise questions and waited, and the truth had arrived more or less voluntarily. She had seen this before. She used it herself in examination rooms when patients were minimizing symptoms or holding something back. Create a quality of attention that feels like the other person already knows, and most people will save themselves the trouble of performing. She had not expected to recognize it in him. 3 weeks in, she found something she did not like. The pharmaceutical supply chain for the clinic had a portion small, 15% that moved through a distribution node she could not fully document, not illegal on its face, but connected, she was fairly certain, to a network that did not keep clean paperwork. She brought it to him the following morning. Directly, in front of Rafe and Thomas, who was the quiet large man she had learned was always present near Dominic without ever quite being introduced. I need to talk to you about the Mercer Street supplier, she said. Dominic looked up from what he was reading. All right. The documentation on the controlled supply from that distributor has gaps. I know what it probably means. I need you to tell me plainly. He set down what he was reading. The supply is real. The medication is legitimate. The paperwork is not complete. That's not acceptable for a licensed clinic. The alternative, he said, is a fully documented supply chain that takes 6 weeks to establish, during which the clinic opens with approximately 60% of the formulary it needs to treat the patients we're building this for. She held his gaze. That's not the only alternative. In the timeline we're working with, give me 2 weeks, she said. No, a regional distributor who works with community health organizations. The pricing will be slightly higher, and the initial order will be limited, but the paperwork will be clean, and we can expand the contract within 60 days. Silence. Rafe, from the corner, made a small sound that might have been suppressed commentary. Dominic looked at her for a moment. Then 2 weeks. Ill. Have the contact information to you by end of day. She turned back to her work. She heard Rafe say, very quietly, to no one in particular that has literally never happened before. Thomas said nothing, as always, but she thought she saw something shift in his expression when she glanced past him. Something that looked like the very early stages of respect. The weeks accumulated. She came to the clinic on Tuesdays and Thursdays, then started coming on Saturdays as the opening date approached. Dominic was there when she was there, which she initially attributed to the demands of the project, and eventually stopped attributing to anything at all, because she simply expected it. Worked well together in a way that surprised her. Not because they agreed they didn't, frequently, but they disagreed productively, which was rarer and more valuable. He would push for speed, she would push for precision. He would identify a structural problem, she would identify the human dimension of it that the structural solution missed. Neither of them wasted the other's time. One Thursday evening, everyone else had left by 7, and they were still going through the staffing plan for the first month. Dominic ordered food at some point, without asking it, arrived Italian, from somewhere that clearly knew his order. She ate without commenting on the fact that he had anticipated her being hungry. Why the pharmaceutical network? She asked. Somewhere around the third page of the staffing document. Looked up. The specific business model, she said. There are easier ways to build what you've built. He considered the question with the seriousness he seemed to give everything. Because it's harder to stop, he said finally. Street drugs, cash operations, those have single points of failure. A supply chain that runs through legitimate infrastructure is distributed. It doesn't have one location you can shut down. And the harm reduction argument. Prescription medication that patients need and can't afford. I don't create the demand, I satisfy it. The ethics are complicated. Most real things are, he said. He looked at her steadily. Did it change your assessment of the clinic? She thought about that, honestly. No, the clinic is what it is. The supply chain is a separate question. And the separate question? I think you're a person who found the most intelligent version of a morally ambiguous path and walked it very carefully for a long time. She met his eyes. I think you know exactly where the lines are, and you've stayed just on the legal side of most of them, and the ones I haven't, I expect I don't know about those. Something moved across his face, not quite amusement. Closer to recognition, the expression of a person who is not often spoken to plainly and finds it unexpectedly comfortable. You're probably right, he said. They went back to the staffing plan. Outside, the city did what Boston does in early autumn, went dark early, got cold fast, and lit up in the specific amber way that made it look like a city that had decided to be beautiful on its own terms. 6 weeks after her first day, she fell asleep on the couch in the back office while reviewing supplier contracts. She knew this because she woke up there at 2 in the morning. Disoriented for exactly 1 second before her brain caught up, the room was dim. On the table beside her, a blanket she did not remember getting, and a cup of coffee in a clinic mug that was still faintly warm. She sat up and held the mug and looked at the wall. She was not a person who let herself want things she wasn't sure she could have. She had learned that early in a house where the adults were kind but not expressive, where love was demonstrated through provision and stability, but not often through the specific warmth of being genuinely known. She had learned to need very little. She was very good at it. But sitting in that dim back office with a coffee mug that someone had left for her before the morning arrived, she noticed something she could not quite put back where it belonged. She was not lonely. Not right now. She could not remember the last time that was true. October in Boston has a particular quality. The light comes in at an angle that makes everything look like it's being seriously considered. Camila was being seriously considered on a Tuesday morning in the third week of October by her own body, which had been providing information she had been deliberately not processing for about 10 days. She processed it, finally, in her office. A clinical test ordered under a research code, results read alone at her desk with the door closed. The numbers were clear. She was a doctor. She understood immediately and completely what the numbers meant. She sat with that for a moment. Then she put the results in her desk drawer, locked it, went to cover her afternoon clinic, and did not think about it again for 24 hours. Not because she was avoiding it, because she was giving herself the same thing she gave her patients when the news was significant space to let it settle before making any decisions. The following week, Victor Salazar came to Boston Medical Center. He arrived as a philanthropist. This was the role he occupied in public, a man with money and a family member in need of specialized care, seeking a consultation through official channels, everything properly arranged. Donor Relations had sent her a briefing note the day before. Met with him in a third-floor conference room. He was a compact, well-dressed man in his mid-50s, with the kind of grooming that suggested considerable investment and the kind of stillness that was not. She noticed immediately. Relaxation, it was control. The stillness of someone who was working quite hard not to betray anything. She watched his eyes. His eyes were wrong from the first sentence. A person who is worried about a family member watches the doctor's face when they explain the medical situation they are hoping, calculating, bracing. Salazar's eyes moved around the room in a pattern she recognized from her work with patients who were not telling her everything. He was not listening to her as a physician. He was filing information. Face, her posture, the way she arranged her hands, what was on the whiteboard she had not erased from the morning meeting. He used her first name once, then caught himself. He asked about her schedule specifically, her on-call rotations, before he asked about treatment options for his family member. She answered every question clearly and provided exactly the clinical information she would provide any consultation patient. When he left, she sat in the conference room for a moment. Then she picked up her phone. Dominic answered on the second ring. She told him what had happened, start to finish, in the same order it had occurred. He listened without speaking. When she finished, he said, "How long ago did he leave?" She looked at her watch. 12 minutes. A pause. Then, "I'm going to need you to trust something." "What?" "That I'll explain everything tonight, not by phone." She looked at the empty chair across the conference table where Salazar had been sitting. "All right," she said. He was there in 40 minutes. Not at the front entrance, she came out to the parking structure on level 2 to meet him, because he had texted the location with the specificity of someone who had thought about lines of sight. They sat in his car. She described every detail about Salazar, his physical appearance, the ring on his right hand, the pattern of his eye movements, the specific phrasing of his questions. He listened to all of it the way she had come to expect. Completely. When she finished, he said, "The ring. Custom signet, right hand, third finger, worn edge. He's had it at least 15 years, she said. He looked at her with a quality of attention she could feel. Victor Salazar has been trying to absorb my operation for the past 8 years. He doesn't use direct confrontation, he finds leverage, connections, vulnerabilities, people who can be approached without appearing to be approached. He was looking for a connection between me and you. He found one, the clinic." Dominic was quiet for a moment. "The clinic's licensing went through standard channels, but my name is on the foundational documents. If he has someone inside the city administrative offices, which he does, he found that several weeks ago." She absorbed that. "So he came to confirm whether I was a genuine advisor or something else." "Yes." She looked out the windshield at the concrete structure around them. "What does something else mean to him?" Dominic said nothing for a moment. She looked at him. There was an expression on his face she had not seen before, something controlled very carefully, something that did not want to be visible. "It means leverage," he said, "against me." She thought about that. Then she thought about the drawer in her office and what was locked inside it, and she did not say anything, because she was not ready to say it yet. She needed more information first. She needed to understand the shape of what she was inside before she made any decisions about what to say. "What do we do?" she asked. "You keep working, I'll handle Salazar." "That's not specific." "No," he agreed. "Yet." That evening, she called her father. He answered quickly, which he always did when she called in the evenings. They talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular, a case she had recently closed, a book he was reading, her mother's new habit of attending early morning yoga classes that he found baffling but quietly admired. The ease of it, the comfortable rhythm of a relationship built over 23 years, was something she did not take for granted. When there was a natural pause, she said, "How are you feeling?" A beat that was slightly too long. "Fine," he said, "tired sometimes, but fine, Dad." Another pause. "Camila." "I know," she said gently. "I've known for a few weeks. I'm not calling to have that conversation tonight. I needed to hear your voice." He was quiet for a moment. Then very quietly, "I should have told you." "Yes," she said, "you should have. But we'll talk about it properly when I come up on Saturday." She paused. "And Dad, the treatment they have you on now isn't the only option. I've been looking at something. It's promising, well talk." She could hear the quality of his exhale, the specific relief of a person who has been carrying something alone and has just been told they are no longer carrying it alone. After she hung up, she sat in her apartment and looked at her phone for a while. City outside her windows, did its evening thing sounds and lights, settling into a particular pattern that she found usually comforting. She thought about the locked drawer in her office. She thought about what was in it, and what it meant, and what she was going to do about it. She did not have a complete answer yet, but she was getting there. The morning it happened, she was early. She was almost always early. But this particular Thursday, she arrived at the clinic 40 minutes before she was expected. Because the supplier contract for the controlled formulary needed to be finalized by end of week, and she wanted to review the terms one more time before presenting them. She heard voices at the end of the hallway. The office door was not fully closed. She was not trying to overhear. She was walking toward the office, clipboard in hand, in a building she had every right to be in. The hallway carried sound. Later, she would think about whether she should have turned around, whether that would have been the right thing, and she would decide honestly that it would not have changed anything, because what she heard was the truth. The truth does not go away, because you choose not to listen to it. The other voice was a man she did not recognize. Later, she would learn his name was Tizano business associate who operated for in the middle distance of Dominic's extended network. Castellano was saying, Shez becoming visible. Salazar is asking specific questions. In our world, that kind of attention on someone close to an operation is a liability. Dominic said, I'm aware. Then you understand why it's a problem. Ill manage it. It's more than management. Dom. Aisha's been around your people talk. If Salazar's people are watching, they're drawing conclusions. A pause. Then Dominic said she's a consultant. That's all she has ever been. Don't mistake proximity for significance. Camila stopped. Castellano said something she couldn't fully hear. Then Dominic again, in the same level voice, the flat measured voice she had heard him use in difficult meetings. The voice that contained zero friction because it contained zero feeling. I never loved her. I don't do that anymore. Make sure that's understood. She stood in the hallway. She was not a person who fell apart in corridors. Had received terrible news in hospital hallways, dozens of times her own hard cases, colleagues' losses, family members of patients who needed her to be completely present in the moment they got the worst information of their lives. She had learned, through years of practice, to absorb and remain functional. It was one of the most useful things her training had given her. She stood in the hallway and absorbed this. Then she turned, quietly, and walked back the way she had come. She sat in her car in the parking lot for 11 minutes. She knew it was 11 minutes because she looked at the clock when she got in and again when she started the engine. Her hands were steady on the wheel. Her face in the rearview mirror was composed. She drove to the hospital, covered her morning clinic, 4 patients, all routine. She reviewed imaging for a consultation at noon. She ate lunch at her desk. In the afternoon, she performed a 3-hour surgery on a patient she had been managing for 6 weeks, a complex meningioma resection that required her complete undivided attention, and got it. Her hands did not shake. Her voice in the operating room was even and clear. This is what people do not understand about the kind of strength that comes from practice rather than nature. It is not the absence of feeling. It is the ability to feel everything and still be completely present for the work. The pain was real. It was also not her primary responsibility in that moment. Primary responsibility was the patient on the table in front of her. She kept that distinction for as long as she needed to. That evening she met Sarah for dinner. She did not say what had happened. She was not ready to put words to it yet. And Sarah, who was perceptive in the way that people are perceptive when they genuinely care about someone, did not ask directly. She just sat across the table and kept the conversation at whatever temperature Camila needed it, which that evening was easy and light, and not about anything at all. At one point, Sarah reached up across and put her hand on Kamala's arm briefly, just for a second, then took it away again. That small gesture, the accuracy of it, the complete lack of performance in it, made something in Camila's chest loosen very slightly. Later, in her apartment, she took the lab results out of the locked drawer and looked at them again. She had known for almost 3 weeks. She had been waiting not for a perfect moment, because there was no perfect moment, but for clarity. for the right state of mind to make a decision from her own center rather than from fear or hurt or some reactive version of herself that she did not trust. She had clarity now. What had happened that morning was its own kind of information. A person who said what Dominic said to Castellano was a person protecting something, not exposing it. She knew this the way she knew clinical patterns, not from one data point, but from the complete picture, the way he had listened to her, the blanket and the coffee. The way he had agreed to her terms without a flicker of resentment. The 2 weeks he had given her to fix the supplier situation, when any other man she had ever encountered in any position of power would have managed her instead. She was not naive about what she had heard. It had hurt. It had hurt in a clean, specific way that she was not going to pretend away. But she was a diagnostician, and the diagnosis, given all available evidence, was not what the words at face value suggested. The question was what to do with that. She thought about it until midnight, when she made a decision and went to sleep. She did not confront him the next day. She did something better. She drove to Providence. Margaret Rise lived in a narrow two-story house on the east side of the city, well kept, with a small front garden that had been put to bed for winter, with the specificity of someone who actually cared about plants. Camila knocked on the door at 11 on a Saturday morning. The woman who opened it was in her mid-60s, compact and clear-eyed, with gray streaking through dark hair, and a face that had learned over many decades to be a great deal more than it showed. She looked at Camila for a long moment. "Come in," she said. "I expect you traveled a considerable distance to get here." Her name was Margaret, but she said to call her Maggie, and she made coffee in a kitchen that smelled the way kitchens smell, when someone has been living and cooking in them for 30 years, layered and real, and entirely unlike the sterile spaces Camila spent most of her professional life in. "Tell me about Alina," Camila said. Maggie looked at her from across the table. "How much do you know that she died 16 years ago?" "My understanding is it was not entirely an accident." Maggie was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was even not because she had stopped feeling it, Camila thought, but because she had felt it so many times that it had become integrated. She told her about Elena, a woman from a English family in Cranston. Quiet and direct, and with a sense of humor that Dominic had found. According to his mother, completely disarming, in the way that genuinely funny people are disarming because they make the world seem slightly more navigable. They had married when Dominic was 26 and Alina was 24. 2 years. Then a car accident that the official record described one way, and the people who knew Dominic's world described another. He blamed himself, Maggie said. He still does. He will tell you he doesn't. He does. And so he made a decision. He said it was a practical one. He said it was about protection, that if no one was close to him, no one was a target. She looked at Camila steadily. And that is true, as far as it goes. But it is also a man who is terrified, choosing a strategy that keeps the thing he fears at a permanent distance. She paused. He has not been close to anyone in 16 years. Until recently, Camila said nothing. Maggie looked at her hands, her doctor's hands, resting still on the table. "When are you planning to tell him?" Camila looked up. Maggie's expression was not surprised, not dramatic, just waiting. "How did you? Because I've been watching my son be alone for 16 years, Maggie said simply, "and when something changes him, I pay attention to what it is." She picked up her coffee mug. "Also, you're a doctor. You know the specific thing you know. And you came here to understand something about him before you said it. That's not the behavior of someone who has nothing to say." Camilla sat with that for a moment. "I heard something yesterday," she said. "Something he said when he didn't know I was there." Maggie waited. "He said he never loved me." The kitchen was quiet. A clock somewhere ticked, and you know. "That's not true," Maggie said. "Not a question. I know it's not," Camilla said. "I also know that knowing it's a lie and deciding what to do with it are different things." Maggie nodded slowly. "He is going to fight it, whatever is between you. He will reach for the wall, because the wall is what he knows. He has spent 16 years building it, and he is very good at it." She set down her cup. "The question is whether you are willing to say what is true even when he has made it as difficult as possible to say." Camila was quiet for a long time. I think, she said finally, that I'm going to tell him the truth, not because he has earned it, because I am someone who tells the truth, and I'm not going to let his fear change that about me. Maggie looked at her for a long moment. Something in her face shifted, very slightly, into something that was not quite a smile but was warmer than anything else. Good, she said. Stay for lunch. She requested the meeting for the following Tuesday, her request, her agenda. She arrived at the clinic at the agreed time, and Dominic was there, in the back office, reviewing something on his laptop. He looked up when she came in. For half a second, 1/2 of 1 second, something moved through his expression. He was reading her, the way he always read everyone, and she let him. She sat down, she opened her folder. She went through the supplier contract updates, the staffing finalization, the projected patient volume for the first month of operation. Clear and efficient, everything in order. When the work portion was done, she closed the folder and did not move to leave. He said something else. She said, Salazar made another contact. This time through the clinic's distributor network, not the hospital. One of our secondary suppliers was approached. She pushed a summary document across the desk. I documented the interaction and blocked the relationship before it could develop. The supplier has been replaced with an alternative. The paperwork is with the clinics. Legal counsel. He read the summary. The room was quiet. Then he looked up. And the look was different from any she had seen from him before, not just assessment, not just the precision of his attention, but something that came from a different place, something he did not appear to be controlling. He said, thank you. She said, it's my job. He said, not this time. There was a pause. Then she stood and picked up her bag. Camilla, she turned. He was still looking at her. Just her name, not Dr. Voss, not what she had been to him for 2 months. Just the name itself, as if he needed to say it that plainly. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once and walked out. Rafe found her in the parking structure 20 minutes later. She heard footsteps behind her and turned instinctively and found him standing a few feet away with none of his usual lightness. His face was serious in a way that made him look more like his brother than usual. Can we talk for a minute? He said. She waited. You heard what he said to Castellano. Not a question, she studied him for a moment. How do you know about that? I was 2 doors down. The hallway carries sound. He leaned against the wall. I need you to understand something, not because he deserves the explanation, because you deserve to know the truth. She was quiet. He lied, Rafe said. He knew I could hear him, by the way, and he said it anyway. Which tells you everything about what was driving it. He paused. When Elena died, De made a calculation. He decided that no one he was close to would ever be in that position again, so he cleared the field. He made sure there was nobody close enough to be used as leverage, nobody whose loss could touch him. That's a significant decision to maintain for 16 years. Hez a significant person. Rafe said it without irony, but what he said to Castellano, that wasn't strategy, that was panic. When something starts to feel like it matters, he reaches for the wall. He doesn't think about it. He's been doing it for so long, it's automatic. He looked at her. He pushed you away before anyone else could take you from him. Camilla looked at the concrete floor of the parking structure. She thought about what Maggie had said. She thought about the half-second of expression she had seen when she walked into his office this morning. And the thing he doesn't know, she said carefully, is what you're not saying. Rafe met her eyes. He was quiet for a moment. Then you need to tell him. I know. He's going, I know, she said again. I've thought about it. I'm going to tell him. Because I'm someone who tells the truth. Not because I know what's going to happen after. Rafe looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face settled. You know, he said quietly, you're pretty much the only person I've ever met who scares me and makes me feel better about everything. At the same time, she almost smiled. Go back inside, Rafe. He went. She did not wait. Long after that, she found Dominic in the main clinic space, alone, reviewing the walkthrough checklist for the construction crew. He heard her coming and turned. She said, I need 5 minutes. He set down the clipboard. She told him what she knew. Directly, without preface, without the language of apology or appeal, she had been carrying a lab result for nearly a month. The result was unambiguous. pregnant the child was his. She said, "You don't get to make decisions about this child. That is mine. But you have the right to know the truth because I am someone who tells the truth. And you have the right to decide what kind of man you want to be about it." Then she waited. The silence that followed was different from any she had been in with him. It was not the comfortable working silence. It was not the thinking silence. It was the silences of someone who has been handed something they have no preformed response to, and who is too honest to reach for a preformed response anyway. His face, which she had spent months learning to read, showed her something she had not seen there before. It was unguarded in the way that only happens when a person is completely off balance, when all the practice control has had a second pulled out from under it, he said quietly. "How long have you known? 3 weeks. Why didn't you? Why didn't you?" He stopped, looked at the floor, then back at her. "You heard what I said to Castellano?" "Yes." He closed his eyes briefly, one brief moment, then opened them. "I lied," he said. "Everything I said to him was a lie. I said it because I know why you said it," she said. He looked at her. "Rafe told me about Elena," she said, "and I was already starting to understand before he did." She held his gaze. "I understand why you built the wall. I even understand why you reached for it. Understanding it doesn't make it acceptable, but it means I'm not walking away. Because you're a bad person. I'm making a decision about whether you're capable of being different." "That's not the same thing." He said nothing for a long time. Then, in a voice that was quieter than she had ever heard from him, "What do you need me to do?" She said, "Nothing right now. I need you to sit with this. I need to see who you are over the next several weeks. Not you say, what you do." He nodded, the nod she recognized, the brief, complete one that meant a genuine decision had been made. She picked up her bag. "Camila," she stopped. "I'm sorry. For what I said, it was." He paused. "I was afraid, and I handled it in the worst possible way." She looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. "That's the beginning, not the end." She walked out into the October afternoon, and behind her, in the clinic that was not quite open yet, she left a man learning that the wall he had built for 16 years was not going to save him from this. The arrest of Victor Salazar's did not happen quickly or dramatically. It happened the way real things usually happen, through a process, over time, through the careful accumulation of evidence, and the decisions of many individuals who each played a piece without seeing the whole. But before it happened, it got significantly worse. 3 days after her conversation with Dominic, Camila arrived at the hospital to find a message from Sarah marked urgent. She called immediately. Sarah's voice was controlled in the way that people who are rattled try to sound controlled. "I need to tell you something before you hear it any other way. Someone approached me yesterday, after my shift. A man, well-dressed, mid-50s, didn't give a name. A puss. He wanted information about your schedule, your rotations, your clinic work on the side, when you come and go from the building." Camila was very still. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing," Sarah said, with a clarity that made Camila close her eyes briefly in relief. "I asked him who sent him. He didn't answer. I walked back inside and went straight to security and reported the incident, and then you called me, and then I called you." Camila said, "Thank you. That was the right call, Camila." Sarah's voice had a different quality now. "What is going on? And I'd like the real answer, not the abbreviated one." She was quiet for a moment. "I will tell you everything. Not on the phone. Can you come to dinner tonight? I'll be there at 7. She called Dominic before she called Sarah back. He answered on the first ring. She told him what Sarah had described. He asked 3 precise questions: the man's physical description, the location, the time of the approach. She answered all 3. When she finished, he said nothing for 2 seconds. Then Hes not trying to get information anymore. Hes sending a message. What message? That he can reach anyone around you. He wants you to feel it. A pause, which means Hes running out of better options. That doesn't make him less dangerous. "No," Dominic said. "It makes him more dangerous in a different way. Cornered is always more dangerous than confident." She was standing in the hallway outside her office, watching the normal traffic of the hospital floor move past her: nurses, orderlies, a patient in a wheelchair being escorted to imaging. The ordinary world, moving at its ordinary pace, 20 feet from a conversation about a man who was running out of patience. What are you going to do? She asked. What I've been building toward for the past 3 years, he said. It's almost ready. I need a few more days, Dominic. Camila Sara didn't have to tell me, she said. She could have convinced herself it was nothing. Gone home. Let it go. She told me because she chose to. I need to be able to tell her enough of the truth to let her make an informed choice about whether she stays involved. A pause. I understand, and I need you to be honest with me about the timeline. Not a reassurance, the actual timeline. 3 days, he said. Possibly 4. After that, Salazar's situation changes significantly. She looked at the clock on the hallway wall. 3 days, she said. Then I need the whole story. Sarah came to dinner. Camila made pasta from scratch, which she only did when she needed to do something with her hands while thinking. Sarah arrived with wine, and without questions, which was its own form of grace, they ate. When the plates were cleared, Camila told her, not everything. The complete truth would have taken 3 hours and involved information Sarah genuinely did not need. But enough. The clinic, who it was connected to, what Salazar was, what the last several months had really been. Sarah was quiet for a long time. Then she said the terrifying man who started showing up outside this hospital around the time you changed. He was watching the building, Camila said. Because of Salazar and other reasons. Sarah looked at her. Other reasons. Camila held her gaze. Sarah set down her wineglass very carefully. Camila Elizabeth's. I know, you're going to tell me I'm telling you now. How far along? Almost 2 months. Sarah pressed her lips together. Then she picked up her wineglass again, looked at it, remembered it was alcohol, and set it back down. Okay, she said. Okay. She looked at Camila with the expression of someone assembling a large number of pieces rapidly. Are you all right? Actually, genuinely all right? Yes, Camila said. Actually, genuinely all right. Does he know? He knows. And? Camila was quiet for a moment. He's showing me who he is. I'm watching. Sarah nodded. Slowly, she picked up the glass of water instead and took a sip. I am going to have many, many feelings about all of this, she said, and I am going to have them in an orderly fashion at a later date. Right now I just need to know, what do you need from me? What you already did, Camila said. Just that, what you already did. Sandra nodded again. After a moment, she reached across the table and squeezed Camila's hand once. Then she said the pasta was very good, by the way. Thank you, Camila said. I think you make it when you're stressed. I do. Good to know for the future. The tension in the room, which had been considerable, broke just enough. They stayed at the table for another hour. Outside, Boston was doing its November thing, cold and specific and lit like a city that had earned its character. On day 2 of the 3 days Dominic had named, something shifted. She was leaving the clinic after a Thursday afternoon session when Thomas appeared at her side, not from anywhere visible, simply there, which was how Thomas usually operated. He fell into step beside her. Mr. Rice wanted me to let you know, he said, that the situation with Salazar is moving faster than expected. In a good direction. She looked at him sideways. Thomas rarely volunteered information. How good? Federal level good, he said. She absorbed that. How long has this been in motion? Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, with the particular precision of someone who had considered carefully how much to say, he has been building it for approximately 3 years. The last several months provided the final evidence needed. He wanted you to understand that the documentation work at the clinic, the supplier records, the formulary tracking, the audit trail was not set up as a trap for Salazar, but it became useful. It became the final piece, Thomas said, because you built it to be accurate. Not because anyone asked you to build it that way. He paused. He wanted you to understand the distinction. She walked several steps without speaking. The evening was cold, the streetlights coming on one by one. He could have told me himself, she said. Yes, Thomas agreed. He could have. She looked at him. Thomas, who said nothing for months at a time, who was present at the edge of every significant moment without inserting himself into any of them. Why did he send you? Thomas considered the question with visible sincerity. I think, he said carefully, because he is better at action than at saying the things that go alongside action, and he wanted to make sure it was said. She nodded. Thank you, Thomas. He nodded back, a brief, complete gesture. Then he turned and walked the other direction, and she continued to her car. The arrest happened on a Thursday morning, 4 days after Dominic had said three, a federal task force. Victor Salazar, at his office building, at 8:17 in the morning. The charges were extensive, and the documentation was, by all accounts, comprehensive. By 10 o'clock, the story was on the local news. By noon, it had reached the national feeds. Camila read about it on her phone, between a morning of patient consultations, in the break room on the fourth floor. Sarah was there, eating a sandwich, and read over her shoulder. Neither of them spoke for a minute. Then Sarah said, "So, that's done. That's done," Camila said. "And the federal level good Thomas mentioned." "Yes," Sarah took out of her sandwich. "I have a lot of questions about Thomas. He's very good at his job. He appears out of nowhere, he does." "That's unsettling. You get used to it." Sarah looked at her. "You've gotten used to a lot of things over the past few months." Kamala considered that honestly. "Yes," she said. "Some of them I chose, some of them I didn't. The ones I chose am still good with those choices." Sarah held her gaze for a moment, then she went back to her sandwich. "Good," she said. "That's what matters." He called at noon that day, not to tell her about Salazar. She had already seen the news. He called because he said he wanted to meet. Not at the clinic, but somewhere neutral. If she was willing, she was willing. They met at the Italian restaurant. Not for dinner, it was the middle of the day, and the lunch crowd had thinned by the time she arrived, and they sat at the corner table that was apparently his, regardless of the time of day. He was there before her. He stood when she came in, a small thing, unremarkable in most contexts, but she had not seen him do it before, and she registered it. He said, "Thank you for coming." She sat. "You didn't have to thank me. I wanted to." He sat down across from her. The daylight made his face look different than the evening lighting she was more accustomed to. Slightly more human, slightly less composed. "I owe you an honest conversation. More than one, probably. But let's start with the clinic." She waited. "The documentation you built," he said. "The supplier tracking, the formulary records. All of it. I want you to understand that I did not set up the clinic to create evidence against Salazar. The clinic is what I said it was. It exists because those people need it, and because I had the means to build it." "I know," she said, "but when you pushed for the transparent supply chain and the complete audit trail, that work became the final piece of a case had been building for 3 years." He held her gaze. "It wasn't planned, but it happened because of your standards, not because of my strategy. I needed you to know that." She looked at him steadily. "Thomas told me something similar." A brief expression crossed his face, something between appreciation and exasperation. "Thomas is very thorough, he is." She folded her hands on the table. "I have a question," he nodded. "The FBI contact, Harris. How long has that relationship existed?" 4 years. And you were waiting for the right evidence, something that would hold, something that couldn't be explained away. He paused. "Your audit trail was airtight in a way that mine wouldn't have been, because yours had no possible motive for manipulation. You built it because you believed in the clinic. That's why it holds." She sat with that for a moment. "The clinic is real," she said. "It was not a question." "It's the most real thing I've built in a long time," he said. "Possibly ever." She looked out the window at the street. The city was cold and ordinary, moving at its regular pace. "I have something I need to say to you," he said. She looked back at him. "I have said one lie to your face in the entire time I have known you," he said. "One. The thing I said to Castellano. I want you to know what it cost, not as an appeal, not to make you feel a particular way about it. Just as the truth." He paused. "It cost me considerably more than any decision I've made in the past 16 years. She held his gaze. "Because by the time I said it," he continued, "I had already understood what was true, and I said it anyway. Because I was afraid." The fear was older and louder than the understanding. He looked at her steadily. "That is not an excuse. I am telling you who I was in that moment, and why. So that if you were going to make any decision about what comes next, you make it with accurate information." The restaurant was quiet around them. Someone, at a table across the room, laughed at something. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past. Camilissa said, "I know what happened to Elena." He was still. "Your mother told me," she said. "I went to Providence." I asked. Something moved through his face that she recognized from the clinic, that day she had told him she was pregnant, that brief, unguarded quality. The half second before the control reasserts itself. You went to see my mother, he said. I needed to understand the shape of the thing, before I decided what to do about it. Your mother is very direct, she is. His voice had a different quality when he said it, something that was not quite soft, but was definitely present. She told me about Elena, Campbell said, and I want you to understand that I am not asking you to be over it. I am not asking you to have processed something that a person cannot fully process. What I have asked from the beginning is honesty, not the performance of being fine. The actual truth. He looked at her across the table for a long time. Then he said, I have been afraid of this since approximately week 3 of working with you. Of what specifically? Of how much I would miss it if it was gone. He paused. Of being the reason it was gone. She said nothing. The way I handled it was, he stopped. It was the worst possible version of the thing I was trying to do. I was trying to protect you. I ended up being the thing you needed protecting from. Yes, she said. You did. I'm sorry. The words were plain and complete, without embellishment. Genuinely, she looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, I know you for. I could see it from the moment I walked into your office that Tuesday. She paused. Here is where I am. I am not interested in the version of this where you decide you're capable of more than you actually are, and then prove yourself wrong. I have a child coming into the world who deserves more than the fallout from that. I know, he said. What I am interested in, she said, is the version where you choose honestly every day, even when it's hard. Where you say when you're afraid instead of building the wall, where you are present instead of managed. She held his gaze, that version. I'm willing to work on with you. One day at a time, he was quiet for a moment. Something in his face settled in a way she had not seen before. Not the controlled stillness, but something that came from a different place. Something that looked like a decision being made from the most honest part of him. Yes, he said. Just that. Yes. Outside, the November sky was doing something that couldn't decide between clouds and clearing. The light came through in intervals, uneven and real. Camila picked up her water glass. He picked up his. There was no particular ceremony to it. They were just two people sitting in this restaurant in the middle of the afternoon, deciding, with full awareness of what it would cost, to try. A week after the conversation at the restaurant, Dominic called her about something completely ordinary. The clinic's pharmacy license had received a question from the state board about the formulary submission. He needed her to review the response document before it went out. Entirely routine, he could have emailed it, he called. She noted this. She reviewed the document, called him back, went through 3 points of clarification. They were on the phone for 22 minutes. 14 of those minutes were about the license document. 8 of them were about other things, a book she was reading, an update about Rafe's latest logistical crisis, a supplier who had sent the wrong refrigeration unit, a question he asked about the experimental treatment her father was now several weeks into. How is he doing? Dominic asked. Not as a courtesy. She could hear the actual interest in it. Better than projected, she said. His specialist is cautiously optimistic. He's tired but has himself. She paused. He asked me to pass along a thank you. He doesn't know the whole story, but he knows someone helped open a door. A brief pause. He doesn't need to know the whole story. I told him enough, she said, his perspective. He worked out more than I gave him credit for. She paused. He asked if I was happy. What did you tell him? She was quiet for a moment. I told him I was getting there, that I was in the middle of a thing that was genuinely complicated and genuinely good, and I was learning how to be in both of those things at once. A longer pause. That's accurate, Dominic said. I know, she said. That's why I said it. Sarah insisted on a proper dinner the following Friday, not delivery, not the break room, an actual restaurant with actual table service to mark what Sarah called the conclusion of a very large chapter. They went to a place in the South End that Sarah had been recommending for 3 months. They ordered food Camila had been avoiding because her appetite had been selective for the past several weeks, and tonight it was, unexpectedly, entirely reliable. You look different, Sarah said. Different how? Sarah considered less held. Like you were carrying something in a very particular way for a long time and you've adjusted how you're carrying it. Camila thought about that. That's accurate. And the future, the actual practical future. Have you thought about what it looks like? Some of it, Camila said. I'm keeping my position at the hospital. I'm keeping the clinic work as long as it makes sense. I'm not moving anywhere, and I'm not giving anything up. She picked up her fork. And Dominic and I are building something. Slowly, without a blueprint, is that by choice or necessity both, she said. Some things you can't plan, you can only decide to stay present for them and see what they become. Sarah looked at her for a moment. Trying, Clara, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, she paused. He's better at action than at language. He shows up, he listens, he does what he says Hes going to do. She looked at her plate, and when Hes afraid now, he says so instead of building the wall. That is, that is not a small thing for him. Sarah nodded slowly. And for you? Camila looked up. I am learning, she said carefully, how to let someone be present without waiting for them to leave. That is also so not a small thing. Sarah raised her glass, not wine. She had ordered sparkling water in solidarity, a gesture that Camila had not expected and had been quietly moved by. To not small things, Sarah said. Camila raised her water glass. To not small things. Maggie came to Boston the last week of November. The invitation came from Camila. She called Maggie on a Sunday morning and asked if she would come for Thanksgiving, or around it, or some version of the week that worked for her. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Maggie said, I'll come Wednesday. Is Dominic aware you're inviting me? I'm telling you first, Camila said. A shorter pause. Good, Maggie said. I'll take the 10 o'clock train. Dominic's reaction, when Camilla told him, was a very long silence, followed by my mother is coming to Boston on Wednesday. Another pause. She's never, he stopped. She hasn't come to Boston in a long time. I know she told me. You called her? I did. He said nothing for a moment. She could not see his face. They were on the phone, but she knew what his face was doing, or rather, what it was fighting not to do. Okay, he said. Okay? Yes, a pause. Okay. They had Thanksgiving dinner at a restaurant because Camila's apartment was too small and Dominic's spaces were too vast for what this was meant to be, and the restaurant split the difference. Rafe came. Thomas appeared briefly, ate with the efficiency of someone who needed to be elsewhere, and left. Sarah had gone to her family in Connecticut, but had sent a significant quantity of food in advance, arriving Thursday morning with a note that said simply, "You deserve this." Maggie sat across from Dominic and next to Camila, and the three of them talked for 4 hours about things that had nothing to do with the past several months. Books, the neighborhood where Dominic had grown up, a story about Rafe at age 12 that made Rafe deny everything with great energy. The specific New England quality of November, which Maggie described as winter deciding to be honest about itself for once. At one point, near the end of the meal, Maggie looked at Dominic across the table, just looked at him. The way mothers look at their children when they are not trying to communicate anything specific, just the act of seeing. Dominic said, "What?" Maggie said nothing. "You look well," he said. "I feel he started again. Different than I have in a while." Maggie nodded once as if he had confirmed something. She did not push it further, because she understood, as she had always understood her son, that he would say the thing when he was ready to say it and not a moment before. Later, walking out, Maggie fell into step with Camila. "He is trying," she said quietly. "He is," Camila agreed. "He doesn't know how to talk about it. He does it through the other things, the things he does instead of saying. I'm learning his language," Camila said. "It's different from mine, but it's not incomprehensible." Maggie was quiet for a moment. Then Elena would have liked you enormously. I want you to know that, not to put a shadow on anything, just to say there is room in this story for all of it. The grief and the new thing can coexist. Camila looked at the city around them, the cold, clear, November night, the specific amber of the streetlights, the way Boston looked like a place that had made its peace with being hard and was proud of it. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me about her. For being honest about all of it." Maggie patted her arm once. "You were going to figure it out anyway," she said. "You're that kind of person." December came. The South Boston Clinic opened on a Tuesday morning in the second week of the month. There was no ceremony. Dominic was not a ceremony person, and Camila had not suggested one. The doors opened at 8, the staff was ready, and by 9:15 there were 11 patients in the waiting room. Camila stood at the back of the main intake area and watched for a while. A woman in her 60s waiting to be seen for a knee that had been bothering her for 2 years. A young man with a child on his lap, the child eating crackers with complete concentration. An elderly man reading a folded newspaper with the methodical patience of someone who had spent decades being made to wait in less comfortable places. Rafe appeared at her side. "We're at capacity for the morning." "That's good. It's terrifying," he said, "but also good." He looked at her sideways. "You did a thing, you know. The way this place is set up, the protocols, the layout, all of it. That was you." She watched the waiting room. It was collaborative. It was mostly you. Dom built the structure. You made it work for actual human beings. She didn't answer that directly, but she felt something, a specific satisfaction that she recognized from the best moments in her surgical career. The ones where the work had been exactly right. Dominic came to stand on her other side. For a moment, the three of them just stood there looking at the waiting room. Then, Dominic said, quietly, "Thank you." Rafe said yes. What he said, more expressively. Camila said, "Go handle intake, Rafe." Rafe went. She and Dominic stayed where they were. The clinic moved around them, voices. The sound of the front door opening and closing. The small, ordinary sounds of a place doing what it was built to do. "Are you satisfied?" she asked. He thought about it. "Not sure." "That's the right word," he said. "I feel like something is in the right place." For the first time in a long time, she understood. She felt it too. 3 weeks into December, she was in her apartment on a Sunday morning when the buzzer sounded. She was not expecting anyone. She pressed the intercom. "Who is it?" "Me," Dominic said. She buzzed him up. He arrived at her door with 2 cups of coffee from the place 3 blocks away that she had mentioned once, in passing, as making the best dark roast shed found in the neighborhood. He had remembered. Of course he had. She let him in. He looked around her apartment the way he always looked at new spaces, reading it, absorbing it. The bookshelves, the running shoes by the door, the surgical diagram framed on the wall opposite the window, the one she had put up in her first week as a resident and moved to every apartment since. "That's been everywhere with you," he said. It was not a question. "Since residency," she said. He looked at it for another moment. Then he handed her one of the cups and sat in the reading chair, her reading chair, the one that actually fit the corner properly, as if he had always known it was the right one. Which, knowing him, he probably had. She sat on the end of the couch nearest to it. They drank coffee. She was reading when he arrived, and she picked up the book again. Not because she was ignoring him, but because this was the point that he could be in her space, without requiring performance, without the need to fill every moment with words or attention. He had a book of his own in his coat pocket. He took it out. For a while they were just in the room together, the Sunday quiet of the city outside. The coffee, the particular warmth of a December morning when the heating is working, and the light coming through the window is doing what December light does when it decides to show up clean and angled and serious. She looked up from her page and found him already looking at her, not with the assessment quality, not with the calculating intelligence, just looking. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I was thinking about," he considered the question, "about the fact that I spent a very long time deciding that the only safe way to live was to keep a specific distance from everything that mattered." He paused. "And about the fact that I'm sitting in your apartment on a Sunday morning, feeling more like myself than I have in about 16 years, and trying to reconcile those two things." She held his gaze. "Are you reconciling them slowly?" "Good," she said. "Slowly is honest." He nodded, looked back at his book. She looked back at hers. On a Wednesday evening in late December, she came to his place for dinner. This had become its own rhythm, Wednesday evenings, rotating kitchens. Tonight it was his, and he had made something that involved more preparation than he usually admitted to. Though the kitchen was perfectly clean, as if the preparation had not occurred, they ate. They talked about the clinic's first a specific complex patient, a staffing question that Rafe had managed surprisingly well, A supply issue that Thomas had resolved before anyone else noticed it was an issue. After dinner, they moved to the sitting room. He poured tea, which he had started doing instead of whiskey on evenings when she was there, without comment and without ceremony. She sat at one end of the sofa, he sat at the other, and after a while, she moved slightly closer because the room was cold near the window, and he was warm in the practical way of large people. He did not make anything of it, he just was there. Her hand rested on her stomach. She did it without thinking now. An automatic gesture that had developed over the past month. He watched it and then slowly placed his hand over hers. Not possessive, not asking for anything. Just present. She looked at his hand over hers, then at his face. Are you still afraid? She asked. Every day, he said, and he thought about it honestly. The way she had come to know. He thought about everything completely, without shortcuts. And I remember what the fear is about, he said, what it's protecting. And I decide that the thing worth protecting is better served by staying than by running. He looked at her every day. She nodded. Outside December was doing what December does in Boston, cold and absolute, and somehow still worth living in, she said. I spent a long time learning how to need very little. It felt like efficiency. It felt like strength. She paused. I'm learning that it was also a way of never having to risk anything, that the discipline of not wanting is not the same as the discipline of being brave. He was quiet, listening. Being here, she said. Choosing this all of it, the complicated and the good. That's the braver thing. I want to be someone who does the braver thing. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, You have always been that person. You just didn't always have somewhere safe enough to show it. She held his gaze. Something in the room shifted not dramatically, nothing that would make a particular sound or require a name. Just the quality of two people who have arrived through considerable effort and honesty, and the particular kind of courage that does not announce itself, at a place where they can rest without pretending to be other than they are. She leaned back against the sofa cushion. He stayed where he was. The city outside the window was lit the way Boston lights itself in winter orange and cold and permanent. A city that has survived enough to stop apologizing for its character. After a while, she said, What do you want it to look like? 6 months from now, a year. The actual thing you want. He was quiet for a moment. I want to keep building the clinic into something real. I want to be present for what is coming, he paused. I want to not waste the time I have left on the wrong things. That's honest, she said. You asked for honest. I did. She looked at the ceiling. I want to keep working. I want my father to have more time. I want this, she moved her hand slightly under his, to be something this child grows up inside, something it recognizes as stable. I can do stable, he said. You can be a great many things, she said. Stable is one of them. I've watched you for months. When you choose to be present, you're entirely present. That's what stability actually is. He absorbed that. The thing I said to Castellano, he said, I will spend a long time making up for it. You already started, she said. The making up is not the same as the starting over. You don't have to rebuild from zero. You just have to keep going from here. He turned to look at her fully. She met his eyes. From here, he said. From here. The clinic's last patient of the year was seen on December 30th, a man in his 70s, who had been coming every 2 weeks for blood pressure monitoring, and had, on this particular visit, brought a small tin of homemade cookies for the staff. He set it on the front desk with the careful dignity of a person who does not give gifts often but means each one completely. Rafe accepted it on behalf of the staff and spent about 7 minutes being so genuinely appreciative that the man left looking slightly bewildered in the best way. Camila watched from the hallway. Thomas, passing through on his way to wherever Thomas was always going, paused beside her for a moment. Good year, he said. She looked at him. Thomas, who said nothing for weeks at a time, had just offered a toward editorial. Yes, she said. It was, he nodded, moved on. Rafe came over with the cookie tin. These are extraordinary. I think there's cardamom in here. She took one. It was in fact extraordinary. Has Dominic had one yet? She asked. Rafe's expression was cheerful. He said they were fine. That means he liked them. That absolutely means he liked them. Rafe leaned against the wall beside her. You know, a year ago, if someone had told me that this clinic would exist, and that it would be run by people who had actually figured out how to work together, and that my brother would, he stopped, looked at her sideways. He's different. You know that. I know. Not different like changed into something else. Different like he found a volume setting he forgot he had. She thought about that. He found a place where he didn't have to be the most defended person in the room. Rafe was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said quietly. Yeah, that's exactly it. He ate another cookie. I'm glad you stayed. When it would have been easy not to. She looked at the front door of the clinic, through the window in the door. The December street cold and ordinary and real. So am I, she said. It was a Wednesday evening in the first week of January, when she understood that she had, without planning it, stopped waiting. She had spent so many years holding herself at a careful distance from the life she most wanted, partly from a learned instinct toward self-protection, partly from the reasonable recognition that the life she wanted required trusting someone, and trusting someone required risk, and risk required a kind of faith in her own ability to survive disappointment that she had not always had. She had it now. It had been built, she thought, over the last several months by 1,000 specific things. The coffee left before morning. The Tuesday call that was 22 minutes instead of 5. The way he had stood in her apartment and looked at her reading chair, as if recognizing it for what it was. The way he had said, I was afraid, with the plainness of a man who had decided that honesty, even when it cost him something, was more important than the performance of control. She was sitting at his kitchen table. He was across from her, doing something with paperwork that she had not interrupted. The tea was warm. The city outside was cold. She was not waiting for anything. She was here. This was real. And she had chosen it with full knowledge of what it was, the complicated and the good, the history it was built on, and the future it was building toward. A relationship between two people who had both been shaped by loss and had both, through entirely different paths, learned to keep going anyway. She put her hand on her stomach. He looked up. She said, Come here. He set down the paperwork, came around the table, crouched beside her chair, so they were at the same height. She took his hand and placed it where hers had been. He was very still. Then just the smallest thing he leaned his head forward, until his forehead rested lightly against hers. No words, no ceremony. Just the two of them, in a kitchen in January, with the city outside doing sweet cities do, and the future being exactly as unknown and exactly as possible as it always is. She closed her eyes. He stayed where he was. This was the beginning. Not a declaration, not an ending. The beginning chosen with full awareness of what beginnings cost and what they're worth. Outside, January was deciding to be itself, cold and honest, and if you knew how to look at it, quietly beautiful. Inside, two people who had both spent a long time keeping the world at arm's length were learning, one day at a time, the specific and irreplaceable discipline of letting it in. He told her he never loved her. It was the only time he lied to her face. She walked away, not because she was weak, but because she had enough self-knowledge to understand that staying where she was, not being met honestly, was not love, it was accommodation. And she had accommodated enough for enough years to know the difference. What changed him was not the pregnancy. You cannot shock a person into wholeness. What changed him was watching her refuse to beg, refuse to become less than she was in order to fit inside his fear. She held a standard for herself first, and then for what she was willing to build, and he found, to his own considerable surprise, that the standard was exactly what he had been looking for, without knowing he was looking. They did not have a perfect ending. They had something more durable, a real beginning. The kind that two people who have been through genuine loss and genuine survival build together slowly, honestly, with no guarantee except the daily decision to keep choosing it. The child born in the spring grew up knowing certain things as simply true, that the people who loved her were capable of being afraid and staying anyway. That strength was not the absence of feeling, but the willingness to feel completely and still do the right thing. That love, real love, was not a declaration made once in a significant moment. It was a practice. Daily and unglamorous and worth every bit of the effort, they got a lot of things wrong over the years. They disagreed badly on some things and recovered from those disagreements and learned from them. There were Wednesday evenings when the silence was uncomfortable, at the Thursday sessions when someone said something imprecise and it took time to find the accurate version. But they stayed and they were honest. And every day, without exception, they chose the thing that scared them each other and the life they were building over the safety of the wall. That is the whole of the story. It is also the only story that matters. All elements within this narrative are fictional and crafted for storytelling purposes. The author bears no intention of referencing real people, cultures, or events in a literal sense. Readers are encouraged to engage with the work as a piece of creative expression rather than documented reality.
Before we close, I want to stay with you for just a moment longer, because this story was never really about a mafia boss and a surgeon. It was about something much closer to home than that. It was about the wall. The wall that intelligent people build quietly, carefully, brick by brick, after the first time something they loved was taken from them. Dominic Reyes did not become cold because he was born that way. He became cold because being warm had cost him everything once, and his mind made the only logical decision it knew how to make. Never again. Most of us have a version of that wall. We just build ours in quieter ways. And here's what this story says about that. The wall does not protect you. It preserves the wound underneath it, unchanged, untreated, waiting. Real healing does not happen behind a wall. It happens in the specific discomfort of letting someone see you clearly and choosing to stay present anyway. Camilla did not save Dominic. That is not what this story is. She simply refused to perform smallness to fit inside his fear. She held her own standard for honesty, for self-respect, for the kind of love that is built daily, rather than declared once, and in doing so, she showed him that the standard was possible. That is the lesson worth carrying out of this story. Strength is not control. Strength is honesty. The most powerful thing any person can do is tell the truth about what they feel and what they need before the moment to say it has passed. Because the people we push away to protect them and ourselves are exactly the people we cannot afford to lose. Do not wait until the cost becomes clear to say what is true. Say it now. Say it.